And this is the gravesite of Austin Dabney, who is kind of being rediscovered as a black patriot and a hero of the Revolutionary War. And I came out here to tell his story and also importantly to show how to find this, because Find a Grave doesn't have proper instructions. So Austin Dabney was born to a Richard Aycock in North Carolina sometime in the 1760s. We don't know when exactly. And then in the late 1770s, Aycock decided to move to Wilkes County, Georgia, and the call was placed for men to join the militia. So Austin Dabney was sent in Aycock's place because Aycock said, he's not a slave, he's a freedman, and he's sort of my servant, but he's still free. Now this was a lie because Aycock had drawn the draft and he was a bit of a coward. So Dabney goes off to join Colonel or Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Clarke, who is my favorite hero of the Revolution, and fight side by side with the other Revolutionary War patriots at the Battle of Kettle Creek, the most famous of all battles fought in Georgia.
Make ready! Take aim! Fire! Secure! Fire!
And what's important to note there is that we don't know for certain that he fought there, because there was a man that they described as Moorish who was named something along the lines of Austin. They spell his name incorrectly, but if this is to be Austin Dabney, then it would be that he fought side by side and wasn't just a porter, he actually manned the guns.
Basically what happened that day, Andrew Pickens, Elijah Clarke, John Dooley came out up here at the north side of the battlefield and divided into three groups. Pickens took 200 of his men down the center. Clarke went to the left here with about 50, John Dooley to the right with about 55. They came upon about 700 British Tories. Some of them were right down here near the cane swamp, and they were butchering some feral beef they had found, feral cows. John Boyd was in charge and was the leader that day, and as they attacked, he early on was shot and eventually fell mortally wounded in this area here. So it was about 45 minutes. It wasn't a huge, long battle. Andrew Pickens writes later that it was one of the hottest, most violent, bloodiest battles he had been in, and he'd been in quite a few.
There's some displays here in the Kettle Creek room on Austin Dabney. And I think what's so interesting is that Austin Dabney was the first slave who was freed with the help of a couple of people he used to fight with and given a land. Now if you look here, you can see an artillery gun. Now Austin Dabney, his specialty at Kettle Creek, or his specialty in the Revolutionary War, was artillery. Now the only person that was at Kettle Creek that was black, you have Ambrose, Harry, Dick, and Austin. Now Austin sounds an awful lot like Austin, but there's no real proof that it was Austin Dabney. But we know that Austin Dabney fought alongside Elijah Clarke, and we know that he was an early unsung hero of Georgia folklore. And I think it's fascinating that the contributions of blacks in the Revolutionary War are finally being recognized. 30% of patriots were black men. After the Revolutionary War, he was actually wounded in the hip at the Battle of Kettle Creek, and he was nursed back to health by his good friend Giles Harris. And Austin Dabney was so revered by other veterans of the Revolutionary War that when his former master, Aycock, tried to get him back, they decided to grant him, the state of Georgia, emancipation and award him with 50 acres of land. He was the only black veteran of the Revolutionary War, even though something like 30% of patriots were black in the state of Georgia, to be awarded land for his service. And Harris and Dabney quickly became very good friends, and their story picks up after the Revolutionary War. After the war, Dabney began receiving a pension first from the state and then from the federal government, and his fortunes greatly improved alongside the Harris family. What's so interesting is that he started studying law, and he even made enough money to send the Harris son to college. And when their son was born in 1835, they named him Austin Dabney. In the early 1820s, there was a land lottery for pioneers here in Georgia. Austin Dabney, being a man of the law, actually was not awarded any ticket in this because, you know, he was black. However, the veterans who were still in power, it was the 1820s, but they still remembered the service of Austin Dabney. It's very interesting how little we have written about him, but we know that he was an illustrious man because people in power decided to keep basically raining good fortune on him. He was given 100 acres of choice land here, and a story that's often told about him is that he was riding to Savannah with a white colonel named Pope to receive the pension directly from the governor, as you did back in those days. And basically the governor opened the door, and she, by the way, rode behind the colonel on his horse because that was the social custom at the time, even though the Colonel Pope, had tremendous respect for him. And the governor opens the door and says, "Austin Dabney, spend the night in my guest house." And the colonel had to spend the night in a public tavern. This was the level of respect that Austin Dabney had from the governor of Georgia himself. In 1830, Austin Dabney's long life came to an end. He was buried here not far from the Harris family homestead. And when his friend William Harris died in 1838, 8 years later, he was buried right alongside his old pal from the Revolutionary War. And although it was Giles Harris who nursed Austin Dabney back to health, the entire Harris family was linked to him for years afterwards until his death, and to the point where 180 years later, descendants of the Harris family actually visited to rededicate his grave and give him a proper marker. One of the relatives here, William Harris, who was a good friend of Austin Dabney, maybe a brother of Giles, was buried next to him. And even though Austin Dabney was long talked about in the Revolutionary War history circles, he was only afforded a very decent headstone, along with that of his friend William Harris, in 2010 by the Sons of the American Revolution, and actually friends and descendants of the Harris family. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about how to get to his grave, because Find a Grave suggests that he is in the town square, and he is absolutely not. He is here near these power lines, kind of off in the woods. And if you want to see Austin Dabney's grave, this is where you'll have to park, on the corner of Joy Drive and Pope Street in Zebulon. And come to think of it, I can't imagine Pope Street being named after anybody other than Colonel Pope from the Austin Dabney story, where basically the governor of Georgia had Dabney stay inside of his mansion and Colonel Pope stay inside of a local tavern. This would be the same as, you know, telling General Mattis that he has to sleep in a hostel while the private first class gets to stay in the embassy. And you will continue down this road through the gate for a third of a mile, quarter mile, and you'll turn left and continue on to his grave. And after that short walk, you just follow this curve right around to the left and continue this trail along the power lines for maybe a third of a mile. After making a left turn right near the power lines, you continue down through this cleared land and private forests over the hill, and the Harris Dabney Cemetery is right here on the side.
Torn from a world of tyrants beneath this western sky, we formed a new dominion, a land of liberty. The world shall own, we're masters here, then hasten on the day. Huzzah, 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 huzzah for free America.